Hello and welcome once more to Cherry Red TV. This is another in our series, My Adventures in Music. And today our guest is Ged Doherty. Hi, Ged.
Hi.
And Ged's had a very interesting career. He started off in artist management when he was in his early 20s. He managed Paul Young for many years during the height of his success. He was then offered a corporate role at running the international department at Epic Records in New York, which he took, and that started a long career working for Columbia Records as managing director, Arista Records as label manager, BMG Records as president, chairman and CEO of Sony. He ran the Brit Awards for 3 years and is currently the chairman of the BPI, and also with his friend Colin Firth has a film production company, and their first film was Eye in the Sky and the second film was Loving. And we're going to find out about Ged, about what he's learnt in his life, the ups and downs, and what he's doing now. So we're going to cover your story basically, and when you were a teenager you were a drummer, weren't you, in Manchester?
Yeah, I started out playing drums when I was about 15, I guess. I came from an Irish family, and I joined the pipe band, and I started out being a bagpipe player, but I realised fairly quickly that I was pretty useless trying to play the bagpipes. I couldn't quite get the hang of it, so I thought, oh, drumming seems easier, I'll become a drummer. So I joined the band as one of those, drummers was just a snare drum. And from that led me into sort of joining local bands and getting into the kind of music scene in Manchester when I was about 15 years old.
And did you see yourself becoming a musician?
At that point in time, it was just kind of a way of escaping, if you like, Manchester. I thought, yes, of course, I had dreams that I'd be in a band and we'd be able to escape Manchester and go and, travel the world and live in London and do all these kind of things. But I realised by the time I was 17, I was absolutely useless as a drummer and would never make it on any kind of platform whatsoever. But I loved being in and around music. And so when I went to college when I was 18, I became the college social secretary, which was in Sheffield at the time.
Yes. And
this was just when punk was exploding. So I sort of took my love of music that I'd sort of discovered as a teenager through bands into my college life there and became the social secretary.
You were telling me you booked bands like Susan the Banshees and the Damned, etc.
Yeah, as I said, when I went to college when I was 18, it was in 1976 when punk was exploding. As far as Sheffield was concerned, it was just discovering, the Damned, the Stranglers, the Adverts, all those kind of bands that I booked when I was there. But the Susie and the Banshees I booked for the opening night of a club called the Sheffield Limit Club.
Yeah.
I was the social secretary at Sheffield Polytechnic, and we were doing quite well, and most of the gigs we were booking were selling out. And two local club owners, George and Kevin, wanted to start this club called the Limit Club because there was no kind of real rock club in Sheffield. And they opened up this club on West Street in Sheffield in a basement and asked me if I'd book all the bands for them. I said, yeah, absolutely. So the opening night we booked Susie and the Banshees, which was incredible, and that put the club on the map. And from that day forward, that became like a regular stop on all the bands as they toured all over the country, the Sheffield Limit Club.
It was quite a good scene, wasn't it? Because the Human League came from Sheffield, I think, Cabaret Voltaire.
Oh, there was Cabaret Voltaire, Human League, Def Leppard. Most of those bands either we gave their first gig to, or I remember a good friend of mine who became a good friend and still is, a guy called Dave Bates, who was the A&R man at Phonogram, who signed Def Leppard and Tears for Fears and many other acts. And I remember him coming up to see a gig at the Limit Club in Sheffield, and I remember giving him a demo of Def Leppard, telling him about Def Leppard. I don't think he ever listened to it because he waited until somebody more important gave it to him. But it was interesting. So a lot of those guys around that time I'm still friends with, who I met then. There was obviously Dave Bates, John Giddings, who obviously promotes the Isle of Wight Festival now, and U2 and Madonna and many other people, and Rob Hallett, who's a very well-known promoter as well. I met all of them when I was like 19 and booking all these bands into either the Sheffield Polytechnic or the Limit Club.
And then when you were, I think, 21, 22, you started your own management company, didn't you? Renegade Management.
One of the acts that I was booking, after I left college in Sheffield, I hated my course. So the student union was a full-time sabbatical position. So I did that so I could skive off college for a year and still indulge in my passion, which was booking bands. And I used to run the film club and all the kind of the art stuff for the student union. And then I got offered 3 or 4 jobs to come to London. I came to work for Paul King and John Reid at the time. There were many John Reids, but this was the John Reid at the time, who then went on to manage Delamitri and the Maccabees and many other bands. And he and Paul King had an agency called Outlaw Agency. And they used to book all the kind of Stray, Strife, Strider, Nuts, all the kind of real heavy rock bands that I used to have to try and book out. And one of the young bands they asked me to book out was a band called Street Band, who were a rock band. Paul Young was the singer of Street Band, which is how I eventually got in with Paul Young. And we set up a management company with him. I hated being an agent, so I left the agency world, went into management, and Paul Young's band that he'd then formed, he'd left Street Band, called the Q-Tips, who were a 9-piece soul band. Actually, at the time, they were called the Harrow Horns, and there were 10 of them. But I remember to this day going to see them at I think it was the Greyhound in the Fulham Road. And I walked into this pub, and there were like 300 dancing people everywhere, mainly women. And I thought any band that could attract that many women on a cold Tuesday night, must be good. And this was Paul's band, and they were playing all these soul covers, Sam and Dave, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, all these acts that at the time I'd never heard, because from a kid, I was into kind of rock, progressive rock, then glam rock, from sort of 15 onwards. But by the time, I guess I must have been, 19 or 20 now, at this point, maybe 20, I discovered Stax and soul for the first time through Paul Young and through the Q-Tips.
And how did you feel the first time you saw him play as a performer?
I remember thinking, I don't know anything, I'm 20 years old or whatever I am, but he's the best singer I've ever heard in my life. And I just, I couldn't believe, because I'd only ever seen him sing rock before, and he's got one of the most pure, sweetest soul voices I have ever heard still to this day. And I remember going up to him after the gig, and I was like, "Oh, I've just started a management company. I'd love to manage you guys. I'm going to take you out for dinner. Let's go anywhere you want. Have whatever you want. Drink as much as you like." I was trying to be Billy Big Boots, and him and the guitar player went out to dinner. They ate and drank themselves crazy, and I came to pay at the end with a credit card, and the restaurant wouldn't take a credit card, so he had to pay, and because from the cash they just got from the gig, he had to pay. And I remember him saying to me, "Anybody who can get me to pay for dinner can definitely be my manager." So that started a 14-year relationship with him, and I managed him all the way from the Greyhound in Fulham to playing at Wembley Stadium, or setting out Madison Square Garden or wherever it was, all over. He was huge all over the world. Because
for me, management is one of the toughest jobs. Having done different things myself in the music business, it's the one where you get involved with the most detail, you can have the most frustrations, and it often is about how stable the person is as an individual, obviously. But you were happy to go straight into management after the agency side?
Yeah, I hated being an agent. I spent a lot of time trying to sell bands to promoters who didn't really want them.
Yes.
And you talk the promoter into booking them, then the record company wouldn't provide the tour support, or the band didn't really want to do it. So it just seemed like an endless task to do it. But in management, I loved management because it gave me a great education of dealing with the live side of things, publishers, record labels, PRs, touring, merchandising, and it gave me an overall sense of the business. And I was very fortunate with Paul as my first client, that he and I, we went everywhere together and we became best mates, and we'd go on holiday together, and it was really kind of me and him and another friend of ours, Ian, who was the keyboard player, arranger, Ian Cooley. It was kind of us against the world, and I loved being in management. But like you say, it's a thankless task, because it's always the manager's fault. No one ever thanks them, ever. Yeah. And if it happens, it's down to the act or the record company, and if it doesn't happen, it's always the manager's fault. But I was fine with that.
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't realise until we had a phone conversation 2 or 3 days ago how quickly he became so big, because I think his first 6 singles were top 10. His first 6 solo singles were top 10.
Back-to-back top 10s, yes. Exactly, in every country, pretty much every country in the world. Yeah.
And his first 2 albums were number ones.
Both number one albums, and again were number one in most countries in the world, including America. First album wasn't number 1 in America, but the second album was.
And I also didn't realise until you told me that actually nearly all his songs were cover versions, but fairly obscure cover versions. And
yeah, we used to enjoy Paul in particular, and Ian, Ian Cooley, his keyboard player, arranger, partner, who's probably the most talented musician I've ever come across. They used to delight in finding obscure songs. So Paul's first number 1 in this country, a song called Wherever I Lay My Hat, which was number 1 in July 1983, was an obscure Marvin Gaye B-side. There was originally a kind of up-tempo, bragging, man about town, bragging song, whereas Ian and Paul rearranged the entire thing, slowed it right down. Got Pino Palladino, who was in the band at the time, who's become one of the most famous bass players in the world, with that searing, beautiful, slow bass line, and with Paul singing over the top of it, and it became a soulful, almost a song about regret and lament, as opposed to bragging, and it became a number 1 single, which was great.
And that's quite unusual, isn't it, these days, that bands or artists are quite happy to do obscure old cover versions?
It is. It's funny because at the time he got a lot of criticism for doing covers. Because at the time everyone was like, "You got to write your own material. You got to write your own material." But when the Beatles started out, they started out doing covers. The Rolling Stones started out doing covers. All these acts, whilst they honed their own songwriting craft, were never ashamed to do covers. Frank Sinatra did covers. Elvis Presley did covers. It was never looked down upon. But in the 80s, if you didn't write your own songs, it was looked down upon a little bit. But having said that, it didn't bother us. We just wanted to find the best material for his voice. And to say we had 6 back-to-back top 10 singles in the UK and all over the world. So that took us to then touring all over the world, which is our love. We just loved being on the road and entertaining audiences and travelling everywhere.
Anyway, a few years later, there was the lure of a job in New York working for a big record company, and was that a difficult decision to take? Because you were offered this job, it was 92, of head of international at Epic in New York.
Yeah, no, at the time it was a very easy decision because I was very young when Paul became successful. I was 25 years old. And it was an incredible experience for me at that age, traveling all over the world. And once I'd sort of been around the world 2 or 3 times, and we got to the point where, say, he would play he was supporting it at Wembley Stadium, or he'd sold out 8 nights at Wembley Arena, or all these things. There's only so many places you can go in management. And a good friend, has become a good friend and still is throughout the years, was Richard Griffiths, who I'd met when I was a young agent working for Paul King and John Reed. And I'd always seen he'd moved to America, and I'd seen how successful he'd become. And I always was quietly, or if I ever got the chance to sort of go live and work in America, having seen that what Richard had done, I thought I'd love to do that. And then I was fortunate enough in '92, he offered me a job to start the new international marketing department at Epic in New York. So I gave up management and joined the dark side of the force, if you like, and went to work for the labels. Which was an amazing, amazing education.
And you had some big acts as well you were working with straight away, wasn't
Well,
there?
straight away we were very fortunate. They'd just signed, Pearl Jam were just breaking, they'd just signed Rage Against the Machine, just signed Spin Doctors, Ozzy Osbourne was making a comeback, Cyndi Lauper was doing well, Michael Jackson was doing well, Luther Vandross. So we had an incredible roster of artists, and quite a mixed roster.
Yeah.
And but it was an education for me, because when you're on the outside from these big companies, you always think that big companies, have no respect for the manager and just say things like, "Oh, screw the manager, he's an idiot, doesn't know what he's talking about." And on my very first day, and my very first meeting at Epic in New York, I was in the label meeting, and those exact words were uttered in the meeting because a manager had asked for something. I won't say who it was who had said it, but they were like, "Sod the manager, he's an idiot, doesn't know what he's talking about." But what was interesting for me was as I worked, I worked for Sony and for BMG when it was combined for a total of about almost 20 years. Because I'd been a manager and travelled all over the world and knew most of the promoters, knew all the media, knew how to break records around the world, I got myself in this position in the company where a lot of the people would come to me because they'd say, "What do you think the manager will say about this? What do you think the act will say about this?" And equally, the managers would come to me and say, you know, you've been a manager, Ged, how shall I say this to the head of promotion or that? So I became this kind of, my office was like, we used to call it the doctor's surgery, the doctor's in, because people would just come in, and I loved that role of being able to say, you shouldn't, if you want to get the best out of the label, you shouldn't go about it this way. You should perhaps say that. It's okay to be honest and say what you think, but perhaps say it from this point of view. So I enjoyed kind of almost playing, you know, two roles, one internally facing, one externally facing.
And that's the key, isn't it? It's understanding the other person's point of view and knowing that the record company, they have a role to play, and they have corporate responsibility. If it's a big record company, they have budgets that they have to be accountable on. And the manager obviously getting the best for his act, but if he goes too far with the record company, he'll alienate them. And so it's a balance, isn't it?
It's a balance. It's, as you say, respecting each other's position and knowing what each other wants out of the situation. And, you know, record companies, you know, sometimes get a bad rap or a bad reputation. My experience, having worked for two of the biggest ones for many, many years, is record companies, generally speaking, the people who work at record companies are music enthusiasts. That's why they got there in the first place. Yeah. They love music, they love being around musicians, they love breaking new acts and finding new acts. And so, you know, you're dealing with enthusiasts who also have to be businessmen. And so it's trying, and so I always used to say to the managers, you know, this is what they're trying to achieve here. You know, and there's a way of getting what you want and a way that the company wants without you selling out your integrity. And, you know, without them feeling they're taken advantage of.
One thing that you also talked about before is that you always tell the truth.
I've always been very blessed to be working with people who value the fact that they knew I would tell them the truth. I always used to say to people, I'm not smart enough to lie to you, to say one thing to you and one thing to that person and something to that person, because I can never remember what I've said to anybody. So I used to say the same to everybody. Yeah. And I was fortunate that I worked in an environment, and I had people like Richard Griffiths and Dave Glue, who were my bosses at the time, and Tommy Mottola, who valued the truth and weren't afraid of the truth. And what a lesson I learned very early on working at Sony, at Epic, was if you're going to lie to people or not tell them the truth about how a record's actually doing or how an act is performing or how a song's building at radio, you're not doing anybody any favours. So you had to tell the truth. And I live to that today. Tell me what the problems are and we can fix it. Yeah. Don't just tell me what you think you want me to hear, because you're not doing anybody any favours.
On the other hand, it is sometimes tempting to tell people, especially if they're an important artist, what they want to hear. And a lot of people do that. And that builds the ego of the artist and brings them away from reality. And I see it happening a lot.
Yeah, again, it's finding that balance, isn't it? And again, to me, it's all about having a relationship with that artist. And because of the time demands often on labels, they don't have enough time to spend with the acts to develop that label, and that relationship. And what I loved about the head of international job I used to get a lot of time on the road with the artist, and that's the best time to get to know somebody, when you're sat in a bus together on a 6-hour journey or on a flight or late one night at a hotel, sat in a bar, or, you know, before the gig, and where you just talk to them about their family, their friends, why they got into what inspired them to write that song. And you develop a trust over a period of time. And then the artist will know that when they ask you something, you'll tell them something. And equally, if they ask you something and you know they're not going to like it, you have enough of a relationship where you say, you're not going to like what I'm going to tell you, but this is the truth. You know, and many times I remember many artists where I'd sit and their record wasn't quite what I thought it should be, or we thought it should be, my A&R team, and I'd sit with them and say, look, this is our view on it. At the end of the day, we'll put out the record that you want to put out. It's got your name on it. It hasn't got my name on it. But we think you should do this, or it needs another song, or whatever. And, you know, at the end of the day, we would back the decisions that they wanted to make.
Yes. Anyway, your career started to move quite fast after that, and in '96 you were offered the Columbia Records in the UK, back in the UK now, the MD job. Was that difficult again to leave, come from New York back to England? Yeah,
it was, because working for Sony in New York at that time was my first time working in a corporate environment, and I loved being in the worldwide headquarters in New York and right in the middle of all of the action where everything was going on. And, you know, Michael Jackson would pop into the office and all the artists would be coming into the office. I remember one time, I was telling you the other day, when I was sat in with Dave Glue, who was Richard Griffiths' boss, and the door opened and there was Michael Jackson, you know, with his glove on and a bandage. And I was like, oh my God. And Dave goes, hey, Michael, come on in. I'm just having a meeting with Ged. Have you met Ged? And he goes, no, hey, Ged. And I go, hi, Michael. So I just got left now. But it was nice, and Luther Vandross would pop in, Ozzy and Sharon would come in. So it was nice having that kind of access to the artists.
You also told me he played you some demos, didn't he, another time, Michael Jackson? He came in and played some demos.
I remember when we were setting up the global marketing plan for the History album, the Greatest Hits album. And Michael used to love where we'd bring in all of the heads of the companies around the world. I remember it was at the Peninsula Hotel in Beverly Hills. We took over one of the big rooms there, set up a big conference table, and everybody came in and they talked about how they were going to launch the album in their territory, including England and the European plans, because I was obviously working for the US company at the time. I remember Richard Ogden and his team had come up with a brilliant plan to build this 60-foot statue of Michael Jackson and float it down on a barge, float it down London with Tower Bridge opening, because they always had this image in their mind. They thought that would make a great marketing campaign, that imagery. And of course, Michael absolutely loved that as an idea. So Richard and his team put it together and did it. And it was, it was front page of every newspaper around the world. So your point being, yeah, he came, and after we told him about all the plans, he was like, oh, do you guys want to hear any music? He said, nothing's finished yet. And we were like, yeah, absolutely. So he was playing as unfinished versions of Earth Song and Black and White and all these other songs that were on History. And it was always ironic to me, because a lot of artists are always reluctant to play their music, even when it's finished. But there was Michael Jackson, the biggest artist in the world, playing unfinished things, where he hadn't even finished the vocals on some of them.
Yeah.
But because he loved being part of the process, he wanted us to hear what he'd been up to.
Yeah.
So that was a great education for me. So then when I got the opportunity to come back to London to run Columbia, I just thought if I don't leave the US now, I'll probably end up staying there. So I made the decision to come back, and I came back. I've been offered the managing director's job at Columbia. And we sort of revamped the whole label in the UK and reorganised how we set up the teams internally, because I'd learned working at Sony in New York. It was my first experience of working with what was called then the Black Music Division. And then there was the rock and alternative guys and the pop teams. And so I reorganised Columbia into that kind of teams, where there were speciality teams working on, acts that they lived and breathed every day. And we were lucky enough to be quite successful, because again, the US company at the time had just signed, Aerosmith had re-signed, they'd signed the Fugees. Mariah Carey, of course, was coming along, was huge globally at that point. So we had a great roster of acts coming through.
You told me that they were number 9. Columbia was number 9 label in the UK when you took over, and then when you left, it was number 1 label. We
were very fortunate, with a great team of people and a great repertoire, to take it to the number 1 label.
How do you build a great team? What's the trick of building a great team?
Well, again, have people who tell you the truth, so you know where you stand. Have people who know what they're talking about, people who actually like music. Because again, in the music business, it's not just people in record labels who love music. People at radio love music. Journalists generally love music. Promoters love music. So everyone involved in the ecosystem generally is a music fan.
Yeah, but Ged, how do you get around this thing? And I only work briefly in a corporate environment. The rest of the time I work for independent labels. I have my own independent label. But how do you get around this thing of people having to watch their back in the corporate environment? So they're wary about maybe saying the wrong thing. If they say the wrong thing, then it might interfere with their career and they might even get the sack. So how do you get people to trust, to get them to tell the truth?
To me, that's not a symptom of being in a corporate environment. That's just human beings. And my experience, whether it's 5 people in a company or 500, you get the same human dynamics, that people want to be heard, they want to feel trusted, they want to feel valued for the work that they do, and they want to work in an environment where they feel safe to be able to tell the truth. But again, you get some people who don't like the corporate environment. You get some people who will never feel safe enough to tell you the truth. So there's human frailties in human beings, as opposed to, in my experience. Now I'm sure there's probably many people who've worked for big companies who had a different experience. I can only go on what I experienced. And as I say, I was always fortunate enough to work for people who valued that. It would have been a very different environment for me if I'd have worked for somebody who didn't value that and didn't want to be told the truth.
So in a way you were choosing your bosses as well, because presumably when you went to a new job, you already knew the character of the boss and you thought here's someone I can work with and I can be truthful with.
Absolutely. When I first went to work for Sony in New York in 1992, a very good friend of mine who'd worked there for about 10 years gave me the best piece of advice that I'd ever had going to work for a company. And that was always manage your boss.
Yeah.
Manage upwards. Manage your boss. Never let them come to you going, what the hell's gone on here? Why haven't you told me about that? Why didn't you tell me there's going to be a problem? So always manage them so they know what was coming. So in terms of choosing your boss, yes, I was very fortunate that I've only ever been offered, I think, 2 jobs in my life, or three jobs. And each time I was able to, for want of a better term, choose my boss, or at least buy into who my boss was going to be.
So it's not just the company, it's the people.
It's the people.
Yeah.
People make any company.
Yeah.
As I say, whether it's 5 people or 500, it's all about the people. And that's what artists gravitate to. You know, they gravitate to people. I used to have a simple philosophy, which I used to go to these corporate strategy meetings, and people would have these big packs of, 30-page decks they were going to present on a screen with all the slides. And I used to have one piece of paper, and I held it up, and it said, have fun, have hits, make money. That was my strategy, because in my experience, I'd learned if you're having a good time and you employ the right people, you'll have a better time. If you're having a good time, you'll attract the right artists. If you attract the right artists, you'll have hits. If you have hits, you'll make money. The more money you make, the more fun you have. The more fun you have, the more people you'll attract. The bigger artists you'll attract, the more money you make. It was a virtuous circle. That might seem a bit daft to have that kind of have fun, have hits, make money. But that's been my strategy my whole career, and so far, if I can find any wood, it hasn't done me too bad.
But a lot of artists are attracted by money.
Of course, just as a lot of people are, and a lot of executives are.
Yeah.
And again, that's human beings. That's what I mean, to me, it's human beings at the centre of any of these companies. Yes. And some human beings are motivated by fame. Some human beings are motivated by money. A lot of artists are motivated by the art and being able to get their art out to the world. So yes, of course, but there are artists that,
So I guess when you sign, so what do you look for when you sign an artist? Because you're already giving clues that you're looking for a certain integrity, you're looking for someone that the art is key and not just making money. So what are the factors that are important when looking for an artist who's going to be successful?
Well, apart from the simple philosophy of have fun, have hits, make money, the other thing I've always tried to adhere to is if you take care of the art, the commerce will always take care of itself. Again, that's something I learned working in a corporate environment. You can have the best accounting team, the best sales team, the best marketing team, but if the art is not right, it doesn't matter how good they are, they're not going to be able to sell it. And back to your question about what to look for in signing acts, like everybody in this business, I made probably more mistakes than the ones I got right. That's the nature of the business. But if I look at, for a band like Kasabian, for example, who I was very involved with signing, when I looked at Tom, the singer, in the eyes, I knew he was a star. There was just something about his presence. When I first saw Paul Young and I saw him on stage, I thought he's the best singer I've ever seen. When I saw Tom from Kasabian, and so I remember Serge, when we signed them, there was only 3 of them. They didn't have a drummer. I think they had 2 songs. But there was just something about Tom that I just thought he's a star. And I felt in that instance, even on those 2 songs, there was enough in the basic arc to be able to build on it and help them build a repertoire. And, we put a team around them who helped them with their songs, with their live performance, with everything about them. I used to have a guy who used to work with me, a guy called Mark Pinder, went on the road with the band for about a year. We went through like 5 sound men, 8 lighting men, in helping them develop their art.
What do you see when you look in their eyes?
They've either got it or they haven't got it, and I can't explain it. And by the way, I've not always got it right.
Yeah.
But there was just something about Tom that I just thought he is a superstar.
Because it's so interesting, because I did an interview with Martin Heath, I think you probably know.
Yep.
He ran Arista for a time. And he said when he signed the Killers singer, I think it's Brandon Flowers, he said almost the same thing. He looked in his eyes and he thought, this guy's going to be successful.
Yeah. That's how I felt about Tom when I signed Natasha Bedingfield. Whether you like her music or not, she came and sang in my office, and I just thought she's a total star.
She came and sang in your office, really?
She's a total star.
Yeah.
And I say you don't always get it right, but at least you've got a chance if the act themselves have got something going for themselves, where they've got that either kind of personality or that aura around them that people gravitate to, then at least you're well on the way.
Anyway, as time is finite in this interview, we need to sort of go through your career and then look at things more generally. So you were then offered the job as Arista.
Yeah, I was at around Columbia until '96, and
99.
excuse me, no, '99. I've lost my 1999. Richard Griffiths, who had employed me at Sony, had then left Sony. He'd gone to work for BMG, and he'd come back to the UK. He was the president of Europe, and he was reorganising the whole company. And he asked me to come and work for him at Arista, which at the time I think was the number 11 label, and we'd just built Columbia up into being number 1. And I was like, why would I come and do that? And I just started to learn to play golf. I'm a useless golfer. And he said, you can play as much golf as you like, because when you're a managing director at a label, that's what people do. They expect you to go and do that. And I just thought, oh, well, I'll give it a go. And I loved Richard, and he was the best boss I ever worked for, and learned so much from him. So the thought of working with him again was hugely appealing. So I went to work with them. They reorganised the labels. There was, a lot of labels came in under the Arista banner. The week I joined, the Whitney Houston album came out and went to number 1. I remember getting a basket of flowers from Clive Davis saying, well done. And I was thinking, well, that taught me another lesson. It's all about timing. If you can be, so you can, if your timing is right for you and everything that's going on, it's easier to build momentum for a company. If you can get some timing going, you get a little bit of luck. So we started doing well, luckily from day one with Arista. And then at the time, then suddenly this amazing roster, TLC, Usher, Outkast, Pink, all these amazing acts were coming through from the US label. Whitney, Santana was revamped. So the challenge for us then was to build up the domestic side of the roster, which we...
And how do you prioritise acts? Because here you are, and I worked at Arista years ago, so I know what Clive Davis is like. He's very much focused on the acts that he wants to break. Quite rightly, they're his signings. So how do you then focus in terms of, you've got these acts from America, you may or may not think they're all going to do well in the UK and Europe, and you've got your own signings. You can't break everybody.
Can't break everybody, but you've got to be pragmatic about it. You try and again balance the art with the commerce. You try and go for the songs that you and your team think are hits, and at the time we were agnostic whether it was a domestic signing or an international signing. If it was a hit and we could deliver it, and it would build the reputation of the company and help pay the bills, and that's where all the resources would go behind. Now, at the time, we had a great run of R&B repertoire, and at the time, the UK company hadn't broken a rock act. And RCA in the US, which was now part of all the repertoire that was coming through me, just signed the Foo Fighters. And I said to the team, we need to break a British rock act. And we just signed Kasabian. And a lot of our, we spent 2 years building that act and spending more money than we probably should have done. And if my boss had seen the amount of money I was spending on them, might have had a word with me. But it was, he got the fact that for the reputation of the UK company from a domestic repertoire point of view, we needed to break a British rock act. And we were lucky enough to break Kasabian. But it's all about the hits. It's trying to balance, having a hit, building the momentum of the company. Again, having fun, having hits, making money.
And acts rarely break without a big investment, do they?
You sometimes get lucky, but no, there is no such things as overnight successes. And without the dedication of money and people's time, which is just as important as the money, in my opinion, and the enthusiasm. Yeah. Because again, when they go out to the world, to the media contacts, the media aren't stupid. They know when they're being hyped on something because the people involved have been paid to do it, or because they genuinely love that act. And that's what we managed to, again, keep going back to Kasabian, and I'll talk about some other examples, but that was the one that really galvanized our entire company. And the media came along as well, which was great.
And it was also there you started working with Simon Cowell, wasn't it?
Yes, we used to be, we had offices, I think we were both on the 5th floor at the time, and I used to see Simon every day, and he'd started, obviously, Idol had just come along and was launched, which I was involved with. And so to watch him go to being a global superstar was incredible. But he was still as focused on his A&R as he ever was, and still is today. Why was
and obviously still is, so successful?
Why is he successful?
Yeah, he always has been.
He's got one of the most commercial ears I've ever come across. And his attention to detail and his unrelenting pursuit of getting it right. Whether you like the music he makes or not is irrelevant. His pursuit of excellence and getting it right is second to none. And he's remarkable. And he's also one of the few executives, he's an artist. You know, he's a 50-50 executive and artist, and any one point in time can be either. And how you see him on television is how he is. You know, he says what you're thinking often on these kind of shows, or you wouldn't dare to think. But he had the balls enough to say it, and America in particular fell in love with him for that honesty.
Yeah, so it's those three things really. It's the ears, it's the detail, and determination.
And there's actually a fourth thing, being able to drive a team. Okay. Simon always had a very close team around him that he would drove and inspire, and they believed in him. And he is a great, great motivator of people. I learned a ton from watching him and working alongside him.
Yeah. And then, just following on, 2001, you would offer the job as president of BMG, which obviously owned Arista. And then 2004, BMG and Sony merged, and you became the CEO and president of the new organisation. Yeah,
I became the president of what was called the music division of the merged Sony and BMG. And then about a year later, Rob Stringer was poached to go off and replace Donny Ienner as the chairman of Columbia Records in New York. And I became the chairman and CEO of the UK company. And at the time, I was quite reluctant to go forward for it because I'd always been in the background. You know, I'd always had Rob as a boss, or Richard Griffiths, or Dave Glue. There was always people I quite liked being the number two and being in the background. But I felt so proud of the team that we'd built and the acts, and we were having success with domestic acts and the way the company was running. I didn't want to let somebody else come in and potentially screw it up. So I thought, well, it's time for me to put my head above the parapet and take that job and become the chairman and CEO, which I remember someone telling me at the time, you know, those jobs are quite lonely jobs because you have to make a lot of decisions that sometimes are not popular. But I loved it. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed again having a team. We had an amazing team, and we had an amazing run of success.
Could you also keep your feet on the ground? Because isn't that the key when you have a top job? It's about handling all the things up there, but unless you lose touch, unless you keep in touch with what's down here, then somehow it's all going to fall apart at some point.
Well, it goes back to what I said before about having people around you who tell you the truth. Because, yeah, it's very easy when you do those jobs to think, oh, yeah, this is all down to me, you know, I'm the person who...
Absolutely.
It's all down to me. Yeah. And I was fortunate enough to have a bunch of people around me who said, Ged, shut up, you know, or they would help keep me grounded. Or something I've always believed in as well is engaging with your critics. At the time, there was a lot of debate about what was going to happen from a digital music point of view, and, you know, how music was going to... transcend the threat from the internet, and so I would go to all the people who were very critical of major labels and say, why do you think we're doomed? Why do you think we've got no future? What do you think music should be? And I would engage in debate with them, and I would bring them in, and we'd meet with my department heads, and these people would challenge us, and out of that I think it helped us shape what we thought digital music should be, certainly for Sony. And again, that too is grounding in my experience. If you sit with people who think you're useless and think your organisation shouldn't exist and think your entire business model is screwed, that helps keep your feet on the ground.
But you ended up getting fired from that job, didn't you?
I was let go from Sony in 2011, and I knew as soon as the changes that were taking place there. I knew it was time for me to be moving on, and I'd never been fired from a job in my life. But I say I knew as soon as the new regime came in.
You were suspecting it was going to happen.
I knew it was going to happen. I knew my face was not part of that new vision, and that was fine because I'd just signed a new 3-year contract.
But is it really fine? You've got your team of people. You're loving what you're doing. You've got success, and then someone comes along and says, sorry, your face doesn't fit anymore. Is that really okay?
Well, it bruises your ego.
But does it hurt something inside as well?
Oh, absolutely. Because for the last 20 years, I'd been Ged from Sony.
Yes.
Or Ged from BMG. Now I was suddenly like, well, I'm just Ged. Well, who's Ged now? And what is he like and what does he think and how does he reinvent himself, and do I go back in and work for another label? Do I go and become a manager? But it was actually a blessing. It was a huge blessing. At the time, of course, it hurt. But it was a huge blessing because I'd been there a long time. The more I'd become further up the corporate ladder, the less I was in contact with the art and the artists and the stuff that I enjoyed doing. So half the time you're a head of human resources and head of personnel and head of finance. And I was quietly dying inside. But I loved the trappings, I loved the job, I loved everything that went with it. So it actually turned out, I know it sounds a bit of a cliche, but for me it was a bit of a blessing.
So what was actually dying inside, did you feel?
The contact with the art and the artists and being able to create. And build, what I've always loved doing is building teams of people. Being part of the team, building something, me and you against the world. And everyone says you can't do it, you can't make it. I love all that. I love being the underdog and all those kind of things. And so when I left Sony in 2011, as I said, I thought about going into management, but I'd done management. I didn't want to go and work for another label, so I thought I'd try something completely new.
So just going to stop you there, because one thing we didn't talk about was for the last 3 years at Sony, you ran the Brits, didn't you?
Yes.
It must be a huge operation.
Yes, it was again, a fantastic learning experience to actually, the way the Brits works is the BPI owns and runs the Brit Awards.
Yes.
But the chairman of the major labels take it in turns, 2 or 3 years, rotating the chair of what was then called the Brits Committee. It's now called Chairman Brit Awards. And it's your job to organise the show, the look and feel of the show, book all the acts, deal with ITV, deal with everything to physically do the show. And that was an incredible, again, learning experience for me. First thing I decided to do in the first year I took over the show was to book Sharon and Ozzy as the hosts for the show, because there'd been a lot of criticism in previous years about the show was getting a little bit safe.
Yes.
So I thought, well, let's jump straight in here. And obviously Sharon I knew from when we worked with her and Ozzy at Epic in New York. And so we booked them, and they were great hosts, and there were a few television gold moments, as they call them, because of that booking. So again, I was learning about television and live shows, and just the scale of doing something like that was again, a great experience. Yeah.
So anyway, you were telling the story about what happened when you left Sony.
So I left Sony and decided
reevaluating things.
Yeah, reevaluate, and decided to sort of jump in at the deep end again and go into the film business. I only knew 2 people in the film business. I knew Nick Angel, who'd been a music supervisor for many years and worked at Island Records, and a good friend of mine, Colin Firth, the actor. I'd met him in Ethiopia in about 2002. I was there with Dido. We were doing some work for Oxfam. And we'd become, he's a massive music fan, and we'd become good friends through music. Used to go to gigs together and things. And so when I left Sony in 2011, I fancied going into the film business. So I rang him up and I was like, I don't want to start this company that's film. At the time we were going to do film, music, television and comedy. Because I used to go to comedy clubs 2 nights a week. That was my big passion. And I even went on a stand-up comedy course to learn how to write comedy and to improvise comedy, which was always great because you used to have to do a lot of speeches at Sony. So having that kind of no fear of standing up and people taking the mickey out of you and being able to respond back. So it was a very useful course doing that. But at the time we decided to focus on film at that point in time. Instead of doing film, music and television altogether. So we focused on film. We started a company called Raindog Films, and we've spent the last 5 years building a roster of acts, if you like, a roster of film projects. Our first 2 films have come out and have done incredibly well.
But tell the story about how you found the script of Eye in the Sky, your first film. It's a great little story. I was
at Martin Mills. I remember after I'd left Sony, he sent me a lovely note saying, well, now you no longer work for the majors, you can be invited to my summer party. Martin Mills from Beggars, who owns Beggars Banquet. So I went to his summer party. This would have been this was summer 2012. And I saw a guy called Doug Darcy, who I'd known many, many years ago when we signed the Q-Tips to Chrysalis Records. I knew Doug from back then. And Doug was like, oh, what are you doing these days? I said, oh, I've gone into the film business. I'm doing this now. He said, oh, you've got to meet my mate, Guy Hibbert. He wrote Prime Suspect. He's a really great screenwriter. And Guy had a few beers, and he came up and he pitched me the story of Eye in the Sky. And I just loved the concept of the film and the moral dilemmas of what the story talked about. So I read the script that night, thought it was brilliant, remember sending it to Colin. And at this point, I'd only been in the film business, like, I don't know how many, 10 weeks, 12 weeks or whatever it was. Hadn't read that many scripts, but I remember thinking this is an amazing script, sent it to Colin. And Colin had been aware of it, his agent had already sent it to him. And he's like, yeah, this is a really, really good and important story. But that moment in time, we decided not to get involved with it. Then the following summer, President Obama announced that the US had admitted to killing civilians in drone attacks for the first time ever. Up until that point, they'd only ever said that they'd killed terrorists. So Colin rang me up and he said, whatever happened to that drone warfare film, Eye in the Sky? I said, well, let me find out from Guy. So I got back in touch with Guy. They hadn't managed to get it made at that point, so I managed to persuade him then to give us the rights to make it. And within 6 months of us getting the rights, we were making the film. I moved to South Africa for 5 months to shoot the film, and we had Helen Mirren in it. It was Alan Rickman's last on-screen role. Aaron Paul, who plays Jesse from Breaking Bad, was in it. We put a great ensemble cast together. And it came out last year and did incredibly well.
For your first film to do so well is extraordinary, really, isn't it?
We were very lucky. It was a small budget film. We did $40 million close to it at the box office. It was the #1 grossing independent film in America for most of last year. And won all kinds of awards and things, which was lovely. So that was our first film, so we were very lucky. And again, for me, it was focusing on the art. I just loved the script and loved the subject matter and about putting a team of people around it.
I think it was more than that, because we were talking on the phone. It was saying you want to make films with a social conscience. It's not just the art; it's also the subject matter of the film in terms of bringing something informative and positive.
Well, Colin and I decided from day one we were both quite fortunate. He'd been successful in his career, I'd been successful in my career. We weren't making films for the sake of making money. We'd both done quite well from a business point of view. So we decided if we were going to make films, we would try and make films that would either have some kind of social impact or shine a light on issues that we felt people should be discussing more, like drone warfare. At that point in time, very little was known about drone warfare. And as I say, it was only when President Obama made that decision to say that, yes, we have been killing civilians, that then drone warfare became front-page news. And we decided to do that film. Our second film was an interracial love story, a true story of a couple who married in 1957 and were thrown in jail because she was black and he was white in America. A true story today that still resonates in race relations today and in terms of legal precedents. The same-sex marriage act that the US Senate recently voted on was based on our legal case for Richard and Mildred Loving. So again, something that was very topical. Our next film, which we haven't announced yet, we'll be announcing soon, is about the lead up to the Iraq War in 2003. And it's a true story of a whistleblower who blew the whistle about the US and the British government colluding together to spy on the 6 undecided members of the UN Security Council to blackmail them into getting them to vote to go to war. Because, of course, the US had decided to go to the war many, many months before March 2003 when they did go to war. So it's all about that kind of all the president's men whistleblower type of thing. Where the whole thing about fake news and lying and the responsibility of the news media versus what government. So all topical subjects right now with what's going on in the US in particular. So we like to make those kind of films. We'll never make any money doing it, but we enjoy doing it.
Yeah. And you've said more than once, you're not primarily driven by money, you're driven by the art, you're driven by the creativity, you're driven by the enjoying doing something.
We have been so far, but with the reality of coming home, now I'm an entrepreneur for running a small company, the reality of that, and I remember Paul Russell, who was one of my bosses many, many years ago, him always saying to me, it's been one for the show and one for the dough. So we've been doing ones for the show to build the brand of the company. But from now on, we'll have to balance that out. I think with maybe perhaps doing something that's more commercially viable, which will help us then still being able to do the films that we really want to do.
And you're also chairman of the BPI, the British Phonographic Industry, which is the trade body for record companies, which is obviously a part-time role. Yeah,
I do 1 day a week it works out about 1 day a week for the BPI. The BPI, for those folks who are watching who don't know what it is, it's one of the trade organisations. In the music industry, it represents the 3 majors, Sony, Warner, Universal, and about 380 independent labels. Some wonderful independent labels that we deal with, your own included. And we're a lobbying organisation where we try and get the collective views of recorded music rights holders, and either lobby government or lobby people like Google and YouTube to pay all of our artists fairly, and all those kind of things. But we also own, as I say, the Brit Awards, the Mercury Music Prize, the Classic Brits, so involved in running all that. And I used to sit on the council when I was the chairman of Sony, so I knew the workings of the organisation quite well. Always thought it had done a brilliant job of trying to get a collective view and bring all these very disparate people together to get one view to represent to government. And then when Jeff Taylor, who's the chief executive, rang me 2.5 years ago and said, would you be interested in being the chairman of the company? I said, well, I haven't been in the business for 4 years. You must be desperate if you're ringing me. And he's like, no. He's like, no, you'd be great, you know, with the experience you had. And I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go back into it. It was Colin who said to me, you should do it. You know, the experience that you've had in the industry from the age of 18, you know, it's time to, you know, you to give something back, if you like, for... and so I rang Jeff and I said, okay, let's do it.
You see, it's this consensus thing, and it's like, obviously, when you're a manager, you're dealing with record companies, and when you're a record company, you're dealing with managers, and when the BPI, you've got the three multinational companies, really big companies with their interests, and you've got some very small companies on the BPI council as well, have completely different interests, and it is this knack, isn't it, of finding a consensus where everyone can move forward together, so no one feels completely left out. And there are global issues that do affect everybody, and there are individual issues that only affect certain companies. So it is an art, something like the BPI, in finding a way to have everybody reasonably happy most of the time.
You can't keep all the people happy all the time. I learned that very, very early on in my career. But by being honest and straightforward with people and say, we can do this, this is why it makes sense.
Yes.
We can't do that, this is why it doesn't make sense. Or this is why that person doesn't agree with your point of view, but together we need to have a united front to go to government. You know, so we spend a lot of time kind of lobbying each other, I suppose, and trying to bring everyone to the same point of view. But what has been surprising for me, more so than when I sat on the council originally, up until 2011, there's a real collegiate atmosphere, I think, now in the BPI Council, where the major representatives and the independent representatives always happy to fight for their position and give their point of view, but very happy to listen and be persuaded to the other person's point of view. I've seen that happen. Yeah. Whereas there was a time that would never happen.
No, I remember that, and I as a council member, I agree there is this ability to listen, and I say I use the word ability because that's an art in itself, to listen to the other person's point of view. And that brings me on to, we have to finish in a couple of minutes, but also, like myself, you find yoga and meditation very important in your life, don't you? Is that going back a long time, or?
Yes, I was fortunate enough to discover both of those, oh my God, 18 or 20 years ago now, because I was constantly stressed, constantly travelling, and constantly exhausted. And a good friend of mine said, you should try yoga and meditation. So bit by bit got into them, and I still try and meditate most mornings. And I forget who the director was I was reading recently. He made some quote within his meditation, that's where you catch the big fish. You know, when you go deep down into that meditation, that's where ideas come from. But yeah, it helps keep me vaguely sane and vaguely centred.
Yeah.
And but yeah, it's important to get that balance. That's something else I've learned over the years. Because if you're not balanced and you're not centred yourself, you can't give other people centred, balanced advice.
You've got to hold something, haven't you? Especially when you're running an organisation or a big project, you've got to hold a certain, not so much aura, but a certain balance, yeah.
Try and remain balanced and try and remain fair. And it's hard if you're dealing with your own demons the whole time, or you're exhausted, or you're, to remain centred and true for that person and give them, and here, as you said before, a big part of what I do is listen to people.
Yeah.
And often don't say anything, just listen.
And look in their eyes.
And engage with them as human beings. And like I said before, people have this thing about companies and corporations, and it's human beings at the end of the day, it's people.
Yeah.
Whatever we're in. And I've been fortunate enough to work with some amazing people my whole career.
Jed, that was great. Thanks very much for coming on to Cherry Red TV.
Thanks for inviting me, Ian.
Giving us your wisdom and your stories. And you've had a great career, and it's the career's not over yet, I can tell that.
I've had an unbelievable career, and I enjoy what I do every day of the week. I'm very lucky.
That's a great motto to have, enjoy every day. Thank you again for watching Cherry Red TV, and I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.